First, let's go to Mike in Billings. Hey, Mike, what's your thoughts, question or comment?
Thank you for taking my call, Aaron. I grew up in Yellowstone a little bit. I lived in there for 7 years back in 86 to 92. In 88, we had fires that devastated the park. Yellowstone Park is a gem that we just don't appreciate. And at the time, following the fires, elk were dying on a highway, and there wasn't, the fires were very political. And with that, the elk were dying because of starvation, nothing to do with the fires. And I keep hearing this stuff about climate change, and we just don't want to realize what's happening to us, what we're causing. And it's just, you're talking about what's happening with elk going off onto other lands and such. Buffalo were doing that at the same time, and they were slaughtering these buffalo because of no grazing. And it's been such a political mess, and nobody's taking care of it, and nobody's really addressing the real issues. And I just wanted to bring up, this goes back, and the gentleman is talking about going back into the 30s, and here we are, we're still here, we're doing the same thing over and over again, and we just don't seem to learn. And it's like each one of these things we do affects the other thing. And it is not climate change, it's us.
All right.
That's somewhat my comment here.
All right, I appreciate that, Mike. Yeah, so it basically is the let it burn. Are we still seeing the impacts of the let it burn strategy from back in the day? Dr. Marlow, your thoughts?
Well, Mike is exactly right. In fact, if you look at some of the data that's available, during those 88 fires, the fire really opened up the Hayden Valley, got rid of that canopy cover that I mentioned before, and extended the availability of grass. Well, now the forest is doing what forests always do, recovers from the fire, and so we're losing the extensive grass production that there was in the Hayden. And so now those animals are migrating out of the Hayden over into the Lamar to gain access to more forage, which, again, is the animal's inherent behavior. They move where the forage base is available.
All right, very interesting. Another caller on the line here. We've got Elena in Phillipsburg next up here. Elena, a question or comment from you?
Thank you. I have both. My main question is all this information, Doctor, that you and a bunch of other professionals have researched and did all the information. The question is who is it going to be used by, and for what goal or an agenda? Now, also, if you can give us an explanation of the 3 C's: cooperation, collaboration, and coordination. And this all ties in with the common goal and who's going to use this information and manipulate it to their purpose. One such group or collaborative just came into creation. It's the Montana Outdoor Heritage Project. Now, this shows you just how these collaborative groups come into being and what they're going to use. And I'll bet you they'll use your information. And the first thing they ask is a survey. You should go to that, especially Aaron, you should go to that website and see what I'm talking about.
Yeah, shoot me an email with that. Yeah, because that'd be good. That'd be good to check out. Yeah, and you're right. You know, all these studies. You know, various organizations will try to use any of these studies to go in their direction. You know, the UC Berkeley study. Well, this is climate change, so that's why we have to be part of this Climate Action Council. So yeah, appreciate that, Elena. Thanks for calling in, Dr. Marlow. Yeah, I know you mentioned that this study was done for the U.S. Forest Service. So how does the Forest Service intend to use the study, and how do you think other groups might now also use your study results?
Well, the first thing I would point out is the Forest Service is a public agency, and so they are obligated to provide that information out to any interested party. Montana State University is a state institution, so once we have fulfilled our obligation to the contracting organization, which would be the Forest Service, then we are obligated to release the information. So it's really available to anybody that requests it now. I do know that the Custer Gallatin Forest has already requested from us a a sensitivity map outlining the areas that are most degraded so that they can begin work on it. So I think the Custer Gallatin is moving about as aggressively as they can to begin to address this issue. Now, going back to cooperation and coordination, we've had an interagency bison group made up of the Forest Service and the Park Service and Department of Livestock and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and I'm probably leaving out 10 other organizations, plus the Native American signatories to some of the earlier treaties. And I would submit that this information is available for them to use in their ongoing deliberations. They meet 2 or 3 times a year. So it isn't as if this has been going on in a vacuum. That interagency bison group has a very well-organized and very thoughtful group that are trying to address this issue.
Well, and I'd imagine that the Trump administration could also take a very close eye look at this study to say, hey, this should give us a sense of urgency to bring about some reforms inside of the park to look at how we can improve not only the range inside the park, but it's also having a broader impact on other public lands outside of the park. So the Trump administration could take a look at this as well.
Well, true. But I again would give high accolades to the Custer Gallatin. I mean, they have decided to do their job without any outside pressure. So I think the forest supervisor and the biologists and range cons deserve a real tip of our hat because they're trying to move forward and get out ahead of this curve.
All right. Well, good stuff. Well, Dr. Clayton Marlow, really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for staying on with us a little bit longer.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right, and keep us posted as more news on this front develops. If you see that they end up, taking this study and doing something with it. Great to talk with you. Thanks for your service at Montana State University. All right, this has been a big topic just going back decades, but there's been several new studies that have been released here looking at the range both inside Yellowstone National Park and then outside the boundaries of Yellowstone National Park. So how do we make sense of all these various studies that are out there? Especially you've got UC Berkeley basically saying, well, no, it's not the wolves. It's not too many bison in the park. It's climate change. That's what's harming the elk. Okay, so there was that study. There's been some other studies out there, apparently an SRM study that came out recently. And then also another, sounds like a really interesting study. It's about the Gardiner Basin north of Yellowstone. And here to talk about that study in particular is Dr. Clayton Marlow from Montana State University. Dr. Marlow, it's great to have you on the show this morning. Thanks for being with us.
I appreciate the opportunity, Aaron.
So tell us about your study. What were the answers you were looking to find, and what did you find?
Well, we carried this work out over a 4-year period for the Forest Service. The Forest Service has become increasingly concerned about the impact of elk and bison leaving the park on Forest Service lands because the Forest Service has multiple use requirements. They're required by Congress to serve a great variety of uses. So they were concerned about what the impact of these big animals was having on their capacity to continue to service recreation, watershed, and forestry needs. So we undertook an extensive study of the Gardiner Basin north of the park boundary, and we were looking at ecological condition. In the end, we wound up sampling a total of 58 sites there and another 17 sites out of West Yellowstone in the Hebgen Basin. We summarized all this information and recently turned it over to the Forest Service for their use as they move ahead in their efforts to take care of the ecological condition of Forest Service lands.
So I know there's a debate over, okay, are there too many bison? Why are they leaving the park? Why are the elk leaving the park? But before we get into that part of the discussion, tell us the impact that this is having on the range outside of Yellowstone National Park. What did you find?
Well, over half, in fact, closer to 70% of the sites that we evaluated fell below the criteria for long-term ecological health. And that criteria was developed by the Forest Service from a broad sampling of southwestern and western Montana. And so when we compared the data we collected in both the Gardiner and the Hebgen Basin to those earlier Forest Service criteria, the system is below its ecological potential.
So that's very bad, to put it straight. Basically, the range is in bad shape in the areas outside of the park. I understand there was an SRM study as well that kind of looked at some of the range problems in Yellowstone. Are you familiar with that study, and kind of what was your takeaways from that study?
That was a series. I think what you're referring to was a series of articles published in January, in which the authors were able to go back and evaluate historic information, clear back even before there was a park. And the overall summary of all the papers was that there were too many big animals being held in the park for the ecosystem, the watershed, the forests, the grasslands, to be able to sustain themselves into the future.
Interesting. So when you combine both of these, I mean, this really sets the debate and the discussion that we've been having really for a couple of, for a number of decades now here, which is, okay, how many large game animals like bison can Yellowstone National Park truly sustain? Do we have too many of them? But it sounds like, whatever you want to point to, the problem for why these things are leaving the park, they are having a devastating impact on the rangeland outside of the park.
Well, it's very true. When we took into account the amount of private land in both the Gardiner Basin and the Hebgen Basin, and then the amount of forest cover, particularly for bison, anytime you begin to get above 25% tree cover on the landscape, bison won't use the area. So when we took all those factors into account, the Gardiner Basin can probably sustain somewhere between 200 and 300 head of bison year-round. The Hebgen Basin, on the other hand, can sustain about 100 head. And so if you look at the numbers of bison in Yellowstone, those two little numbers are insignificant in terms of being able to sustain that Yellowstone population as it is.
This was a quote from an article by Brett French with the Billings Gazette, kind of their outdoor correspondent. Elk and bison numbers have fluctuated dramatically over the past 150 years. Elk populations topped out at 19,000 before being reduced following the reintroduction of wolves in the 1990s. Elk now number around 5,800. So they topped out at 19,000. They now number, he says, under 6,000. But more elk migrate out of the park in winter than in years past, about 75%. And so if you read a separate article that was posted by the UC Berkeley in the Billings Gazette, I mean, basically it looks like the article, what UC Berkeley is saying is, well, that's just because of climate change. So it's not wolves, it's not too many bison that are pushing the elk out of the park. It's just climate change. And I had one friend who kind of summed it up pretty well. He said, when it comes to these land management or wildlife agencies who fail to deal with all these critical issues, this really is the new my dog ate my homework excuse. Climate change. Yeah, it's just because of climate change. So, no, we're not going to do anything about wolves or too many bison. It's all because of climate change. All right. But anyway, joining us here on the show, we've got Dr. Clayton Marlow talking about a study that he conducted, that he and his team conducted, looking at the range outside of Yellowstone National Park. And Dr. Marlow, again, a pleasure to have you on the show. What's your reaction to this UC Berkeley study, where it sounds like, correct me if I maybe read too much into it, but it sounds like they're basically blaming climate change for why the elk are being pushed out of the park.
And climate change is a convenient argument. We do know the climate is changing, but we really don't know very well what that change means, and I think we're jumping to conclusions. I would submit that the truth lies in some of the points you just brought up. 19,000 head of elk had such an impact, both within the park and outside the park, that the rangeland, the shrublands, are still trying to recover from that impact. And so that recovery may, in fact, be slowed down by climate change. But the important thing for managers to keep in mind is that just because that herd dropped from 19,000 to 5,800 over a 10-year period doesn't mean that watershed is recovered. We had the opportunity to do a little study for the Forest Service and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on the old Upper Gallatin exclosures a number of years ago. And those exclosures were built in 1958, 1960 because of concern about too many elk in the Upper Gallatin. And so we've had no grazing on these sites that were believed to have been degraded since 1960. Let's just use that as the rough measure. And in that period of time, we probably saw a 5% improvement in ecological condition without grazing and in the face of climate change. So I would use that as evidence that Gardiner Basin, Hebgen Basin areas, even Dome Mountain, have not recovered from 19,000 head of elk.
Interesting. And then, of course, the follow-up question is, okay, well, what are these land management agencies going to do about this? If it appears we've got bison and issues with wolves, what are they going to do about it? If the rangeland or outside of Yellowstone National Park is suffering as a result of this, did your study present any recommendations at all?
Our study was to provide the Forest Service with an ecological baseline from which they could then make decisions. We used their data, showed them how to take that data and calculate sustainable populations, but we made no recommendations because that was not what we were contracted to do. The Forest Service will make the decisions using that information.
Yeah, it makes sense. It'll be interesting too to see the kind of the broader implications, especially as you've got groups like the American Prairie Reserve in northeastern Montana now trying to have year-round grazing on some parts of their terrain also. So that'll be interesting to see the broader impacts with concerns about grazing from bison and things like that. Well, we're talking with Dr. Clayton Marlow of Montana State University. The phone number for you, 406-294-0970. We got Arnie and Boyd on the line with a question. Arnie, what's your question or comment?
Well, that editor brought it up from the paper or whatever about the 19,000 head, when actually there was 25,000 years ago that there. But this thing has been recovered all the time. It's just like the rancher out here puts thousands of heads of cow on it and they eat it down. But I drive by it every year over here at Santana feedlot where they put them cows on every spring, and guess what? That grass is back there the same. I don't know what these guys are talking about if this earth is supposed to be millions of years old.
So you don't think grazing should be harming it then, or I guess how would you kind of sum up your question?
Well, I mean, where does it do? Them elk, it sustained them elk there. I don't know what this guy's talking about coming back. The grass is ate, it comes back. The grass is ate, it comes back.
Oh, okay. Oh, interesting. All right. Well, let's throw that question to Dr. Marlow. Yeah, Dr. Marlow, your thoughts.
Well, grass will come back, but is it the same grass? And is it coming back because when you look at some of these big ranches, are they irrigating that ground? Does it get grazed one time? It can be grazed one time really hard and come back. The problem in the park and in the Gardiner Basin, the Hebgen Basin, is it is grazed all the time. The elk use it, and then the bison use it. Then they come back and use it again. So these ranches are providing a rest period for those pastures. And we do know that certain grasses recover very well following grazing, and others don't.
Yeah, and that's probably the difference here is on these ranches you have grazing management, you have a management plan, whereas oftentimes with bison or other things you really don't. So that's why that there can be overgrazing versus just the grazing that you might see on a ranch.
Yes, just because it's green doesn't mean it's ecologically sustainable.
Take us back to this debate over all the decades, because I know you've probably been following this just for a number of decades here. But didn't it used to be that back in the 70s, before the movie A River Runs Through It came out, and before tourists started showing up at the Bozeman Airport with their felt line boots already on, before the fly fishing thing took off at the national level, really it was fly fishermen who were concerned about having too many bison in Yellowstone National Park because they were worried that it would degrade the rangeland, which would then muddy up the streams for the fly fishermen, right? And now it's kind of interesting that instead the outdoor community sometimes doesn't necessarily take the same concerns about bison and overgrazing.
Well, that's true. We owe a great deal to the fly fishermen for raising the banner of riparian health and sustainability. And the American Fisheries Society, along with Trout Unlimited, were the first ones in the late 60s to start saying, hey, we've got to look at these streams and rivers. And it wasn't just bison. They said, look at the impact livestock grazing is having on the health of our riparian areas. And so that launched the federal agencies and the university research groups, the ARS, into a decades-long evaluation of grazing on riparian areas. And that's actually why I returned to work on bison, was if, as we have been told, the plains were black with bison, how could we have had pristine, clean streams and abundant trout? And I thought, well, maybe if we understand bison grazing behavior, then we'll have a model to use to manage livestock.
Very interesting.
So that's why I returned to work on bison.
Well, I think your full study now is at animalrange.montana.edu, where they can find your full report. What are the next questions you have after you've completed this study?
Well, the issue that is foremost in front of us now is how do we get the general public to understand the science that we're talking about. I was trained as a young professional that if we have good science, we make good decisions. And this bison elk overpopulation in Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park has actually been going on since the 1930s. There was a meeting in 1936 in Livingston in which they discussed the pending impact of large numbers of elk on the resources in the upper Yellowstone. And for some reason, we in the scientific community can't seem to get the public to understand the impact that's going on.